So speakers, you have 7 minutes. First and last minute are protected. I will signal the end of your first protected minute and the start of your last protected minute with my makeshift gavel. Hopefully you can hear that nice and loud. Summary speakers, you have 5 minutes, all protected. The questions will come from a very small virtual floor of Mrs. Wells and me. So we will do our best to provide you with some decent questions. I am responsible for chairing and timekeeping, so let me just get my timer up. And first speaker for the proposition, off you go.
Esteemed judges, honourable chair, ladies and gentlemen of the virtual floor, today we're here to propose the motion that this House loves lockdown. Firstly, of course, we'd like to define the motion. We'd like to define this House as England. We'd like to define loves as believing that the positives of lockdown outweigh the benefits, such that overall lockdown is positives and our lives will be positive and our lives will be worse had it not happened. We would like to define lockdown as the policy of being confined to one's house to the extent outlined in the lockdown guidelines in England as of the date this motion was released, Wednesday the 17th of June 2020, for clarity's sake. In my speech, I will be discussing the positive impact that lockdown has had in England on social issues. I will also be discussing the positive impact that lockdown in England has had on education, which is a major part of our society as a whole. I will also be outlining the clear benefits that lockdown has had for lowering numbers of COVID-19 deaths. While it sounds obvious, my partner William will be discussing the environmental positives as well as discussing the economic side of the lockdown. Our main point is this: lockdown has saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Over the 3 months of lockdown, at the start of June, a study by Imperial College London suggested that lockdown had saved 450,000 lives in the UK alone. No matter what the opposition seeks to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, surely this is the most important factor in this debate. Next, I'd like to... No, thank you. Next, I would like to discuss the impact that lockdown has had on social issues in England. The opposition will be very quick to try and convince you, ladies and gentlemen, that lockdown is having a detrimental effect on the mental health of the nation. But we would argue that with the current lockdown, this is, as defined earlier, it's not this one-sided. Because of lockdown, people have been given the opportunity much more to engage with regular video calls, phone calls with people across the world with whom they might not have had contact with for a long time. This is bringing society closer together, albeit in a virtual sense. After all, lockdown as defined has greatly reduced loneliness as an issue, as people living alone are allowed to form a social bubble with one other household, and of course 6 people from 2 households are allowed to meet outside. So people do still get the stimulation and mental health boost associated with face-to-face contact, just with a minimised risk of catching COVID-19 as they must remain socially distanced. Yes, please.
Yes, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, surely that the guidelines have been changing over the entire period of lockdown, and you cannot just say that, you know, we're able to meet up with 6 or so people. Well, for a very long period of time that was not the case, and people were suffering because of that.
We understand that, but I defined lockdown as the lockdown that existed when this motion was released, which was last Wednesday, which means that people are allowed to form a social bubble and 6 people are allowed to meet outside. This sounds ideal to us given the situation. Let's be honest, mental health would have been an even more serious issue had thousands and thousands of people lost loved ones had lockdown not happened. So I think being able to see them in a social distance environment or being able to have a Skype call is the better option in these strange times, certainly. Next, I would like to discuss the impact on pupils and education that lockdown has had. Yes, please.
Surely we can accept that lockdown was important and necessary because it obviously saved so many lives, but at the same time, not love having to do it.
Yes, but as I defined, we've defined loves as believing that the positives of lockdown outweigh the negatives, which I will continue to outline in my speech. Next, I will discuss the impact on education. Whilst the opposition would like to try and tell you that pupils have been adversely affected by a lack of face-to-face learning, we'd argue that on the whole this isn't the case. Pupils have been able to access online learning, such as our own school has been using, through Microsoft Teams, OneNote, etc. In a world where our education service regularly comes under fire for not allowing children room to breathe, for being too prescriptive, it has given a welcome opportunity for children to work independently should they so desire. Numerous studies have shown that giving children this opportunity to be more
Point of information.
no, thank you. Improves their chances of getting employment later in life. and of course becoming more rounded people. And for those that aren't this way inclined, their parents are most likely on hand to give them a kick into gear and get them going. So it's a win-win scenario for everyone. Let's have a look at GCSEs, for example. There's a lot of controversy, and there has been for a long time. No, thank you. Over whether children should still take GCSEs. It's a system of testing pupils designed when a large number of pupils left school for work at 16. The lockdown has allowed schools to take children over and above the curriculum, and with these public examinations cancelled, and explore their subjects of interest more deeply. This can only mean that pupils have become more rounded on subjects of culture and historical relevance to them, rather than revising from a syllabus. This can't be a bad thing and could lead to the change of systems in the future. And to look at it from a totally black and white perspective, coming back to my main point, had lockdown not occurred and had schools not closed in March, whilst pupils themselves are unlikely to develop serious cases of COVID-19, they could easily have passed the deadly disease to family members, their school teachers, catering staff, etc. Lockdown is therefore surely in everyone's interest. The key thing the proposition seeks to convince you of, ladies and gentlemen, is that England would be in a much worse situation had we not gone into lockdown. I hope you'd agree that a temporary period of economic decline and temporary social issues are by no means more important than human life, and it is on this basis we're fighting the debate. It is clear that the lockdown, as we defined, where you can meet as 2 households with up to 6 people outside, or be in a bubble with one other household if they live alone, has not caused a great spike in COVID-19. This lockdown was in place for about 2 or 3 weeks, but it's alleviated the social and mental issues associated previously with lockdown. Yes, please.
Does a lockdown not just delay a second spike and so cause more deaths, or the deaths still rack up, whereas it just delays that, so it doesn't cause any emotional sort of well-being, it just delays that fact?
Well, we would argue that it's possibly given scientists time to study the virus more closely, come up with possibly a vaccine or some sort of cure, or drugs, as we saw the steroid-based drug which greatly reduces the risk of dying from COVID-19. And had we just gone on as normal, more people would have died before we discovered that. We mustn't now get complacent, though, and believe we can stop lockdown further. This is clear in Germany, where because of the easing of lockdown, the tripling of the R number last weekend is making a second wave look even more likely. We don't want the lockdown to last forever, but in the bizarre situation we find ourselves in, you must conclude that the positives outweigh the negatives. After all, a model conducted at Imperial College London just before the country went into lockdown predicted a total death toll in the UK of 510,000 had we not gone into lockdown. The figure for deaths in the UK currently stands at about 45,000. That's the choice then, the lives of potentially 500,000 people and their families, or the lives of the economy and education system. There's only one moral choice to make, and we implore you to make it with us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for your speech. And I'd like to invite now the first speaker for the opposition to give their speech.
Honourable Chairman, fellow debaters, ladies and gentlemen of the wider web, my name is Izzy and I'm speaking on behalf of the opposition to the motion "This House Loves Lockdown." Before I begin with a few rebuttals, I would like to outline the opposition's defence. I will be discussing the impact of lockdown due to COVID-19, which has been had on individuals, whilst my colleague Thomas will go on to discuss the wider impact on the economy and society. Ocean will be summarising our debate. I would like to make it clear from the outset that we, the opposition, recognise that lockdown has been essential to reduce death rates, stop mass spreading, protect the vulnerable, and in the UK, the NHS. We recognise that without lockdown, none of these measures would have been even remotely successful. However, it is our belief that we can agree lockdown is necessary, but that does not mean that we have to love it, as the motion states. And while on the subject of love, I realise this may not necessarily be my place, but I would like to refute your definition of the word love. Love, in no context I have ever come across before, means positives outweigh benefits. It means adoration, it means devotion. Love is something, it means enjoyment, and you cannot just sort of define it in a way that's just going to suit you. I would also like to counter your points about education. You said that no, thank you. You have said that education's been good for encouraging independence within students. Well, since your definition of lockdown was from Wednesday last week, are you saying that you have evidence that in 1 week people have been benefiting from this independence when you were sort of generalising the point about being across the entirety of lockdown? And whilst independence is good in moderation, parents are not necessarily qualified as well to be conducting homeschooling. And I feel like, particularly for younger students, it's difficult to be sort of thrust into an environment where there are very lack of structure for education. And I also feel,
information.
Yes.
There are extensive teaching resources available online, such as BBC Bite-Size and EtonX, which have allowed numerous people to experience education at home without necessarily their parents being qualified for it.
I understand that, but I've always found that education is a lot more interactive when you have the interaction with your teachers as well as all of these online resources. They sort of come in partnership with, not as a sort of solitary way for encouraging and teaching education. I also feel it's important to note that despite government guidelines, people have consistently been ignoring social distancing rules, blatantly proving that they are fed up and not in love with lockdown. As the motion states, this can easily be seen by the horrific pictures of overcrowded beaches that have flooded the newspapers this morning on account of the ongoing heatwave. So I would just like to start with talking about a bit about mental health. So since the start of lockdown, people of all ages who are suffering from mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, OCD, or substance dependency are finding it increasingly difficult to cope in isolation. The emergency hotline for people in emotional distress registered a more than 1,000% increase in April this year compared to April of last year. And last month alone, no, thank you. 20,000 people texted the hotline run by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The online therapy company Talkspace reported a 65% jump in clients since mid-February, and text messages and transcribed therapy sessions collected anonymously by the company show lockdown-related anxiety dominating patients' concerns. Now, I understand that you have defined lockdown since last Wednesday, but I find that difficult to talk about this topic without considering lockdown as a whole, considering most of the damage and the suffering that people have been experiencing, no thank you, has been ongoing and from the very beginning up until this point in time. The main issue lockdown has caused for people with ongoing mental health conditions have been that patients have been unable to receive help that they need due to the isolation, and further to that, people with physical health issues such as cancers and degenerative diseases have been unable to receive some treatments due to the decrease in shipping from foreign ports. And further to this, there is an expectation for an increase in death by cancer later this year due to the fact that people have not been visiting hospitals on a timely basis and therefore have not been referred. Lockdown has also been difficult for those who are alcohol dependent or addicted to drugs. Self-isolation can mean vastly increased risk of going into withdrawal and having seizures with limited help. And further to this, shortages have also caused issues with drug quality. Heroin, for example, is being cut with cement in some parts of the country, and a decrease in impurity will most likely cause issues when we are out of lockdown and purity increases again, since people's tolerance will have lowered, and therefore likelihood of overdose and death will increase. It is understandable that some people may not have had an issue with lockdown and that they believe they have enjoyed it and that it's a good thing, and we do not dispute that. However, what is the case for one individual is never the case for another, and the opposition finds it impossible to recognise collective adoration for these circumstances when so many people are suffering because of it. I would now like to talk about relationships, because since lockdown has begun, another key aspect to an individual's life, their relationships, have been put under significant stress. Along with increased reports of more frequent arguments and discord over habits and changing behaviours due to lockdown, most worryingly, levels of domestic abuse have increased. There's been a huge surge of violence since lockdown was introduced. A report conducted by MPs stated that there has been a rise in killings due to domestic violence, and the number of calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline run by Refuge have increased by 49% after 3 weeks. And on the subject of unhappy relationships, Hardeep Dillon, consultant solicitor, family law at Richard Nelson, said that the UK legal firm has noted a 230% increase in the internet search, "I want a divorce." The reason for this is that self-isolation has put a strain on relationships where problems already exist, and feelings of uncertainty around money, unemployment and health created by the coronavirus, compounded by the fact that the current need for isolation is something that many people haven't experienced before. therefore can cause tensions enough for the destruction of partnership and marriage. I would like to end by reminding the floor that even though we as the opposition support lockdown as a necessary measure for containment and saving lives, we cannot support the notion of loving it for all the list of mental health issues induced or worsened by it, how it has acted as a catalyst for want of divorce for many couples. As much as hate is a strong word, love is as much its counterpart, and is a word I would never dream of associating with this current crisis. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your speech. Can I invite the second speaker now for the proposition to give your speech?
Thank you. Fellow speakers, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the virtual floor, it's my honour today to propose the motion of This House Loves Lockdown. Throughout my speech, as Charlie mentioned, I will focus on the economic and environmental implications of lockdown. To begin, however, I'd like to start by making some rebuttals. Firstly, you criticised our definition of love, saying that it doesn't fully encapsulate the the definition of what you think love means. But I'd like to remind the opposition that love, in the sense that they're defining it, is largely based on feelings. It's based on preference. It's a strong emotional response to something. And we cannot have a rational debate over something so subjective as preference or opinion. What we have done is we've rationalised emotion such that we can have a rational debate over the matter using logical argument rather than sentimental assertions. And I feel that that's completely appropriate in the situations. Secondly, you made the assertion that the lockdown, as we defined it, as being the following the guidelines outlined on the date that the motion was released, can't fully encapsulate and capture the full scale of the crisis. And you provided lots of evidence that related to the lockdown measures prior to these revisions. But equally, how can the data that you supplied, which pertains to lockdown prior to the revisions that we outlined, ever capture the public mood after those revisions? They're radically different guidelines. The data that you supplied has no relevance when considering lockdown after the revisions. They're completely different systems, and so I don't think that the evidence and the data that you supplied is particularly accurate. No, thank you. And now on to my speech. I shall begin by addressing the environmental impact of lockdown and proceed to discuss the economic ramifications of it also. Following the activism of Greta Thunberg and the recent Australian wildfires, the issues of the environment and climate change have been on the forefront of the public eye, dominating the media and forming an important part of political discussion. It was inevitable, therefore, that it would become an issue mentioned in this debate today. Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Did someone say point of information?
Yes, I did. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Considering you're defining love as a rational thing, then even if love is rational like you're proposing, since when did it mean a minor improvement compared to what was last? Or
well, since when did a minor improvement
in a minor way? It's better than
yes, thank you. I understand the point. I understand the point. Since when did a minor improvement mean saving the lives of 470,000 people? We love lockdown because it's keeping our country safe, because it's preventing the deaths of those 470,000 people. We're not saying it's a minor improvement. It is a rather severe improvement from the alternative, which would be the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on a mass scale. So yes, we do love lockdown because it's keeping our country safe. And as I was saying, so the impact that lockdown has had on the environment has been particularly profound. Since the introduction of a lockdown policy in Britain, there have been marked improvements in the state of the environment. Air has become cleaner, as there have been fewer people on the roads and using... Yes, go ahead.
You just said that the environmental issue has been in the headlines because of people like Greta Thunberg, but I don't know about you, but in the last few months, partly because of lockdown, partly because of the coronavirus, I haven't heard anything about it. So don't you think this lockdown has actually detracted from our attention towards the environment?
As I'm about to go on and explain, there's actually been a great deal of activism sparked by the current lockdown crisis and the ramifications of this crisis, which I'm about to outline. So air has become cleaner as there are fewer people on the roads and using air travel, resulting in greatly reduced greenhouse emissions. Cities all across the UK, including London, have experienced significant dips in harmful substances in the air in a remarkably short space of time. And for the first time in 30 years, people in northern India have been able to see the Himalayan mountain range, which was previously obscured due to air pollution. Now, I know we defined this house as England, but I just thought I'd throw that example in there just to illustrate the effect that lockdown could have on the environment. No, thank you. Similar changes have been observed in wildlife, as the absence of traffic and human activity has given plants and animals the opportunity to bounce back, resulting in record sightings of previously rare or reclusive species. Now, of course, as I'm sure the opposition is itching to point out, any change in air quality or resurgence of wildlife is merely temporary. And as soon as lockdown is lifted, emissions and life in general will return to normal. However, whilst the immediate effects of lockdown on the environment might not be permanent, there are a number of long-term environmental and mental impacts that lockdown has begun to have.
Information.
No, thank you. The extraordinary improvement in air quality following lockdown has proven that change is not impossible. It has shown that the climate crisis is not too far gone to be reversed, as many previously felt, inwardly or otherwise. In other words, lockdown has taken the seemingly unattainable goal of a greener world and shown it to be a very real possibility.
Point of information.
No, thank you. This exciting revelation has sparked digital activism across the world as activists urge governments to recover from the coronavirus greener and more environmentally friendly, causing significant change to environmental policy. Lockdown, therefore, through illustrating how possible the reversal of climate change is, has sparked an ideological change in society as a whole, resulting in the increased environmental activism and, eventually, long-term environmental change. No, thank you. Now, with regard to the economic aspect of lockdown, the opposition, as I heard that Thomas was going to speak about this in his speech, so I'd just like to jump the gun a little bit. The opposition may try to convince you that lockdown is the cause of the nationwide economic recession that we're currently experiencing. They may try to convince you that lockdown is a policy which, by confining people to their homes, is suffocating the UK economy, a policy without which the economy would thrive and prosper. Ladies and gentlemen, I implore you, do not accept this misguided delusion for the truth. The UK's policy of lockdown is by no means triggering an economic recession. Instead, it is softening the blow of the inevitable economic crisis caused by the coronavirus outbreak. Studies conducted by Cambridge's Faculty of Economics indicate that without a model by which to control the spread of coronavirus, of the coronavirus outbreak, lockdown, the random and rapid spread of COVID-19 would inevitably hit sectors and industries which are essential for the economy to run, resulting in labour shortages in core sectors of the economy. The same studies predict, therefore, that without lockdown, the economy would shrink by 30% or more following the decline of these core industries, over twice that we would see with a lockdown model in place. If we have a lockdown model in place, as I say, the decrease would be only 16% and with a much more gradual rate of decline, giving society a far greater amount of time to recuperate and to adjust to the new situation. Furthermore, I would like to remind the opposition that, according to our motion, lockdown refers to the lockdown guidelines as of the date that this motion was released. And in line with those guidelines, shops are beginning to reopen, people are returning to work, and the economy is already beginning to recover while still maintaining the principles of social distancing, which are keeping our nation safe from coronavirus. Clearly, therefore, lockdown is not some oppressive policy sacrificing our economy on the altar of public health. Rather, it is a shield, softening the blow from the coronavirus outbreak on our public health, our NHS, and our economy as a whole. Besides, even if lockdown were an absolute trade-off between public health and economic stability, the opposition must ask themselves whether they would sacrifice the lives of 470,000 people in order to prevent a temporary economic recession from which we are already recovering. Ultimately, there is but one moral imperative. We agree that lockdown is not a perfect system, as it is in no way ideal for the health of the economy, but it is by far the lesser of two evils, cushioning the impact of the inevitable recession and protecting our nation from the mass deaths of thousands, for which we love lockdown. And so to conclude, I would like to reiterate, we concede that lockdown is by no means a perfect system. We accept that it has its flaws, but we believe that the numerous benefits that it offers on a social, educational, economic, and environmental perspective mean that the positive aspects of lockdown vastly outweigh the negative, such that this House loves lockdown. And of course, we love lockdown for the most fundamental point, that it is protecting our country from the scourge of coronavirus and saving lives. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite now the second speaker for the opposition to give your speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The worst recession since the Wall Street crash, a stagnation in social development, environmental catastrophe just around the corner, rapidly growing inequality, and a society more divided than ever. Fellow speakers, chair, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, the proposition this evening has argued not only that we should embrace this new normal, but that we should love it. They've suggested that we should be grateful for the unique opportunities lockdown presents, but we should celebrate this new normal and reject our old way of life. The true impacts of lockdown, however, are far from positive. Aside from its devastating impacts upon individuals, which Izzy has outlined, the proposition has consistently ignored the bigger picture. In reality, the consequences of social isolation that we've experienced over the past few months threatens to set our communities back decades in terms of equality, in terms of socio-economic development, and in contrast to the proposition's assertions, the fight against climate change. Faced with such grave consequences, ladies and gentlemen, we, the opposition, utterly refute the assertion that this House loves lockdown. But first, a couple of rebuttals. In response to Charlie's speech, you said that since the beginning of last week, when you began your definition of the lockdown, 6 people can meet, which is obviously true, but that's still a lot worse than normal. Usually, as many people as we like can meet, and you said that you suggested that there's less loneliness because of lockdown, I think, which surely is a ridiculous proposition to make. You also said that independent learning has been facilitated by this lockdown, which I wouldn't refute, but the most important place to have, the most appropriate place to have independent learning is at A-levels and beyond, where pupils already have that foundation that teachers can give them. And at A-levels and beyond, they already have the capacity for independent learning, where it's really important. It's not, however, appropriate in younger years, especially in primary schools. But that's what primary school students have been faced with because of this lockdown. So independent learning isn't necessarily a benefit that we see from the lockdown. I'd just like to reiterate our issue with the proposition's definition of the motion once again, because I think it is a very important point. The word love, I think, to any person who hears it, implies a sense of enjoyment, implies a sense of positivity, a sense of benevolence. But William implied that the word love is sentimental, and they're just defining it as enjoyment. No, thank you. Isn't rational. But this isn't about whether it's rational or sentimental. It's about a reasonable definition of the motion. For example, I can agree with you that eating my vegetables or eating my protein every day is definitely more beneficial than not eating my vegetables and my protein. But I wouldn't necessarily that I love eating aubergines, for example, one of my least favorite foods. Similarly, many adults might not love their work, but they accept that it's beneficial to them. No, thank you. They accept that it's beneficial to them because it's important to make sure that they can look after their family. Finally, you spoke about extensively, how the environmental impacts of lockdown have allowed the air to be greener. You said that there's been an improvement in air quality following lockdown. And yet, you defined lockdown as the beginning of last week, when jobs were opening, when industry was opening back up. And I think that's just one example of the contradiction in your motion, because you've defined lockdown as last week, and yet consistently you've used points both in your economic argument and your environmental argument, which refer to the whole of lockdown and refer to the impacts of the whole of lockdown, which I think is a serious issue with the way that you've defined that element of the motion.
Point of information.
Go on then.
You're saying that we shouldn't love lockdown as a way, saying that we shouldn't be concerned with the greater good. We should act on this sort of personal, emotional response. But this house is defined as England. And do you not think that if England were to love lockdown, it would be far more concerned with the greater good of the country rather than individual?
Absolutely, we should definitely act on behalf of the greater good. And of course, we're not saying that we're not concerned with the benefit of England. We're not saying that we're concerned with the lives of those vulnerable people in our society, which is why we believe that lockdown is 100% a necessary and appropriate course of action. But it doesn't mean that we have to love it. Surely that's a clear distinction to anyone who sees this motion without trying to twist it towards a place where the opposition just can't argue it. Anyway, on to my main speech. Perhaps the most well-documented and indeed a hugely troubling aspect of lockdown is the international economic decline and subsequent collapse, which the proposition has largely ignored. Initially, Boris Johnson assured the nation that whilst the figures might look worrying, in reality, the economy is frozen rather than crushed, ready to be reinvigorated at a moment's notice after the pandemic. Such hopes, however, have been rapidly quelled over recent weeks, and the true picture of an economic collapse has emerged. Over 70% of UK businesses are closed or negatively affected by the lockdown, many doomed never to reopen. Already, previously stable large companies and important employers like Mavic, Papyrus and Pier 1 Imports have announced that they won't be able to survive post-lockdown. Similarly, retail businesses have announced that they're closing 4,300 stores UK-wide, which is obviously not a positive impact of lockdown. And I'd ask the second speaker of the proposition whether he thinks that those closures because of the virus, as he suggests, or in fact because of the lockdown, which directly puts people out of work. So although it is necessary, it is the lockdown that's having the negative impact upon the economy. Not to mention, ladies and gentlemen, the countless small businesses struggling to stay afloat. The 6.3 million furloughed workers costing the government £8 billion.
Point of information.
Unemployment soaring to 10%.
Out of time. No.
Okay.
Young people like ourselves will struggle to find employment. Food prices will rise by up to 5%. Employment stability will plummet, and poverty looks set to increase to unprecedented levels in the UK. Those are the effects of the economic damage this lockdown is doing. The proposition loves a global cumulative output loss of $9 trillion because of this lockdown. The proposition loves an economic recovery which will take decades. Perhaps more worryingly than this conviction from the proposition, however, is the proposition's determination to ignore the truly harrowing social effects of lockdown. Foremostly, ladies and gentlemen, this lockdown has acted to further inequality in the UK, both in terms of economic stability, education, and opportunity for social mobility. Pupils from low socioeconomic backgrounds are 80% less likely to receive educational support from family, and they'll have 75 less minutes per day on schooling. And over 35 days, that's a whole week less schooling compared to one of the highest socioeconomically privileged people in our country. Furthermore, a recent investigation found that high achieving students from traditionally low achieving schools are going to be far more likely to be disadvantaged by the algorithm which determines and regulates grades. Low income individuals are also more likely to be made redundant than furloughed during the lockdown, and also affected by the negative economic consequences of lockdown to a greater extent. In conclusion, it's for these reasons that we, the opposition, reject the proposition that this House loves lockdown. Do not be misled by the proposition's portrayal of lockdown as a perfect utopia, free from long-term effects or consequences. Do not be misled by the promise of freedom, social reform, or short-term benefits. Before supporting the proposition this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, ask yourself, do you love economic recession and long-term uncertainty? Do you love further socio-economic equality and further disadvantage to the already disadvantaged? If the answer to any of these questions was no, then it's imperative that you reject the motion of the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we shall go to our very small virtual floor. Mrs. Wells, do you have any questions for either side?
Right, here goes. I've got some questions for both sides, if I may, Dr. Mackenzie.
Of course, please do.
Right, firstly, to the proposition. I'm going to alternate my questions so that you can reflect. To the proposition, you make a very strong case for the positive benefits, but hasn't our lockdown built many barriers, increased and entrenched suspicion? Everybody is fearing everybody else because of disease. Hasn't this created more divisions than it has built the connections that you suggest? To the opposition, similar question, but from the other side, surely our lockdown has actually boosted our creativity. It's made us do things in different ways, discover new approaches. It's led us to be respectful of each other's space, which perhaps we needed to do. And also, perhaps it has made us really valuably reevaluate what we took as the norm and what we valued as our most important priorities. So perhaps the lockdown has given us some real benefits there. I'd be interested in knowing what you think. To the proposition again, I wonder, has lockdown actually locked us away? I'm not sure whether what we've gained outweighs all the things that we have lost, even though we did this for a very good reason, saving lives, as you say, because we've lost the events of a life, a year in somebody's life. Let us go back to your medical illustrations. A year in the life of somebody who is a cancer patient and maybe with a terminal diagnosis is a really big thing. And many events that would have occurred this year, I'm thinking bar mitzvahs, 21st birthdays, they'll never come again. And I think we've lost a lot, and particularly for the older generation who we were seeking to protect. Many of them are feeling that they've lost a year at the end of their lives, and they don't know how many more weeks, months, or years they have left. So I offer that to the proposition. To the opposition, I wonder whether taking the climate change point from the proposition, surely as we have now had a real taste of what clean air actually is, even though we're breathing it through our face masks, and we're observing the renewal of our wildlife in our verges, etc., surely this is actually going to drive our desire for radical climate change interventions, because we can see what we have to gain. And I think just for the proposition again, I'm worrying about the impact of lockdown on the poor and the already disadvantaged. And I am wondering whether they have been disproportionately impacted, and how we will see a bouncing back for many social groups. I mean, how can somebody who has lost their job, their livelihood, their business, maybe people who are already struggling with disadvantage, how can they love lockdown or indeed seek to come back from it? And I know we're debating our motion in this country, but in the US, they've already seen a surge now of evictions and house requisitions. And while we may not face exactly the same scenario, I think we're going to see a huge impact on our society. And I don't think it's going to be easy to come back from that. I'll rest there. Dr. Mackenzie.
Thank you, Mrs. Wells. Excellent questions there. I just have a couple of rather more mundane questions, I'm afraid. For the first speaker, the proposition, you mentioned something about in Germany, lockdown easing has seen the tripling of the R number. But the lockdown that you were talking about is also an easing of lockdown. The lockdown that we've had in the past week has been a much lighter lockdown than we've had in the past. So you're pointing to Germany to see how actually without lockdown, this is the effect, the numbers increase, but in reality, what Germany has is just a different type of lockdown. So is what you love not perhaps responsible for the tripling of the R number there? Also to the proposition as well, a very tiny point. You talked about how in India we can now see the Himalayas. This is a sort of nice evidence of how lockdown has helped environmental concerns. But are you not then acknowledging that there are other types of lockdown to be commended, because India has had a very different lockdown experience from England? And therefore, should you not really be engaging with the opposition's use of data from last week, because you are in fact acknowledging that there are different types of lockdown that have had a particular impact? And then just to the opposition, the second speaker, you talked about even though now we have 6 people who can meet up, different households, it's not really the same as normal. I mean, aside from the fact that, you know, this says a lot about my social life, and meeting up with 6 people at once is quite an improvement from usual. But do you not think there's some evidence to suggest that actually things are better than usual now, because people have to plan to meet up, people have to actively seek out friendships and social interactions that they perhaps otherwise took for granted? People are reporting that they're keeping in touch through WhatsApp, Skype, Zoom, all of these sorts of things, much more than they have previously, and that we have a situation whereby we've had physical distancing, but perhaps not really social distancing, because people are in fact socializing perhaps more than they have previously. So just a few sort of relatively mundane things for you to think about. Yeah, okay. Summary speaker then for the opposition, please. Could you begin your speech?
Judge, Chairman, and members of the virtual floor, as they've been called in this debate, I'm going to be summarising the opposition's argument and just going over some points of clash and why we won them, etc. So, but first I'd like to address a few questions. So, from Mrs. Wells, you mentioned how the increased creativity is quite a good thing and how people have had to find new ways to sort of keep on going. And although I agree with you that this sort of burst of creativity and free thinking is beneficial for us all, and in order to find like new ways at looking at life, it's very important. Is this a love we feel for this? And I know for myself and for others, and also this encompasses Dr. Mackenzie's question, is that the only reason people are finding these is because they have to find a way other than physical interaction. I think we can all agree that we'd rather all be in the AMR or the CLR for this debate, wouldn't we? But we have to do this because of lockdown, and we don't love that change. It's a necessary change, but we don't love that change. I'd like to go over a few points of clash now. So Izzy, our speaker, went over how the mental health implications of such a lockdown, as well as the relationships and how this mental health detriment is age specific. And the proposition first speaker attempted to counter this by saying that people will be happier because less people are dying. However, I believe the opposition speaker still neglects the fact that although the journey in this case is not the reward. Lockdown, much like how I love my sister and I love her coming down to see me when she comes back from uni, I love her seeing me. I don't love the car that gets her here. I love the result of that, and I love the people there afterwards, but I don't love the lockdown as a thing, an emotional attachment to that, do I? None of us do. And then William Caskey went over the economic impacts and the environmental impacts, which were counted by Thomas very well, I believe. And I believe the proposition have got an unrealistic optimism for the economy. And in the recent months, government debt has doubled. We're now at 86% debt, up from 40, which is absurd. And saying that this economic recovery will be quick, will be fine, is nonsense. And the same, this is going to take decades to pay off even. Furthermore, with the environment, as seen in 2008, during the recession, environmental impact went down. And then shortly afterwards, when we're out of the recession, it went back up 15% from what it was beforehand, because people now have less money to spend on trying to sort of comfortable income to spend on prioritizing the environment. So here we can see how this environmental sort of, you're trying to pull something out of nothing. You're assuming that this is going to happen without looking at historical evidence. And you mentioned how it would be a zero emissions economy would be beneficial and how it's obtainable now. We have like a sight of the future. However, doesn't this just show how unobtainable it is? The only way that we get somewhere close to 0% emissions, not even at 0% emissions, albeit, is with everyone frozen in their houses and nobody really going anywhere, no one really living. So doesn't this just show how unobtainable it is? Because this is the extreme length we're going to have to go to get somewhere close to environmental, a good environmental future. Also, I'd just like to go back to that a contradiction of use of information from before lockdown. So you're saying lockdown as of the release of the motion, however, using data from before that, And you could argue that now, because of this our lockdown that you have defined, you're using figures from all the way through lockdown, which just makes your argument rather ambiguous and rather confusing. So you also mentioned how I feel like the proposition's main crux of that argument was that less people are dying, therefore more people are happy, and that's why we should love lockdown, without considering any of those other people who wouldn't be affected by these deaths. And although more people would have died if there had been no lockdown, you're forgetting about the longer term deaths, such as the 2.5 million who have missed cancer screening, as well as the rise in employment. It's gone up about 1.5%, which estimates show that there are about 60,000 people will die because of this. And what really hasn't been shown in this proposition's argument is that this is a love, this is an emotional attachment. You haven't shown that this is a feeling, something that we should be emotionally happy for, love. All you have really shown is an emotional sort of how this is good rationally, and how it is good for somebody's love and somebody's emotions. You have not proved that to us, and that's why I would persuade the House to side with the opposition. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Can I invite the summary speaker now for the proposition, please?
Ladies and gentlemen of the virtual floor, the opposition and the judges, I want to ask you this. Why are we in lockdown? Are we doing it to damage the economy? Are we doing it to prevent children from having adequate education? Or are we trying to damage our collective mental health? Of course we're not. We, the proposition, love lockdown because it is saving people's lives. And I hope that we have made it clear that there is a clear moral imperative to having lockdown, and therefore we love it. Before continuing with my main bit of my summary, I'd just like to answer a couple of points from the floor. So Mrs. Wells mentioned about how it sort of built barriers and entrenched, societal divisions or whatever. But I disagree with that. I think we, the proposition, disagree with that, because I think, if anything, it's actually united people. For example, things like our clap for our carers. We can still meet people online as well. I mean, I'm not really sure it's necessarily, built these metaphorical barriers or entrenched people. I just don't think that's true at all. And I also don't think that we've lost more from lockdown than what we've gained, because there's a moral imperative to save people. We've got to look after the most vulnerable people in our society. We've got to. It's our moral imperative. We have to. And also, yes, you also mentioned about, loss of events, bar mitzvahs, 21st birthdays. Yeah, fine, that's granted, but it's a sacrifice that we're willing to take for the health of lots of people throughout the country. Our mental health, after all, would be a lot worse if lots more people had died. And then there was one about the impact of sort of disproportionate impact between different socio-economic groups. But I think that the government is actually trying very hard to have extensive support schemes. So, for example, furlough, where they pay 80% for your wages, and that's keeping lots of employers from going bust. If you look at other countries, although obviously this isn't exactly in the purposes and bounds of our debate, we've seen the massive job losses, such as in the USA, which is not happening at a greater scale in this country, because we've got support schemes available for those who really need it. And I think the government is definitely pumping lots of money into people's livelihoods to stop this from happening. And there was also a discussion about the comparison to Germany, but I don't really think comparing the UK and Germany is necessarily the same. I think because, in Germany, yes, their R0 was tripled, but that's because they don't really have social distancing. It's voluntary. They've eased their lockdown. Whereas here in the UK, it's 2 meters and 1 meter plus in the future, but that's not in the grounds of our debate. So I don't think it's fair comparing the two. And we also, on your discussion of different forms of lockdown, we're not refuting all the other forms of lockdown. Rather, we are commending the current measures in place in England. So I think both Charlie and William have made it clear that there are lots of potential benefits to lockdown, as well as stressing the importance of saving lives. Charlie made the point that there is lots of technology that makes it possible to meet up with others in a socially distanced way, as well as stressing that COVID-19 may have a positive effect on children's education, as it allows them to explore subjects that interest them in greater detail. In the real world, ladies and gentlemen,
You will have to motivate yourself, as the deadlines are not always strict, and hopefully this lockdown will help teach vital skills to children and teenagers so that they can treasure throughout their whole lives. And I know you mentioned, you know, about younger children not having the skills to be able to do that, but I think, you know, they've got plenty of lessons available. They've got, you know, interaction with pupils and between pupils and teachers on Zoom, Microsoft Teams, WebEx, whatever, and also, you know, there are extensive things such as EtonX, which offers free online classes, as well as, you know, BBC Bite Size, which does extensive things like that as well. And also, I'd argue that actually I've had, in a weird old way, more contact with my teachers than I would have otherwise. Because, I mean, you know, GCSEs come the 12th of June, you're off, you're done. Whereas, you know, when we're here, we're able to delve into the subjects that we find more interesting, which we would not have done in last year, for example. And so William, also other important points, namely the environment. This COVID lockdown is having a very positive impact on the environment. And this is something that can be carried forward into the future by incorporating it into future development, as we realise the important impact it's having on the world. You know, we've all seen the news stories about, you know, people seeing all these different birds out of their window and things like that. And that is something that we can improve on, and we can add green architecture and stuff into our new designs in the future. We can improve. And plus also, William made the point that the lockdown is softening the impact of a recession, and its gradual lifting in the future will help us get back to normality once this is over. And Oshan sort of mentioned about how lots of environmental things have changed since 2008, when obviously there was a massive financial crash. But of course, lots of things have changed. Sorry, I think I minced my words there. Lots of things have changed since 2008. For example, you know, the rise of Extinction Rebellion and things like that. It's now an entirely different ballgame. It's now at the forefront of people's minds and hearts, because they realise that it's actually a really big issue. Mahatma Gandhi said that the true measure of a society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable people. Lockdown has saved lives of vulnerable people, and that's why we love it. It's because it's saved hundreds of thousands of lives potentially. We don't quite know, obviously, the full figures, but you know, that's what we have to cope with. And obviously, people's mental health would have been a lot worse had more deaths happened. And I think that's why we implore the floor to side with the proposition today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So that concludes the main section of our debate. Mrs. Wells and I will share a few thoughts at the end. But for this next section, can I just invite, you know, I'll give you 30 seconds to have a little think, gather your thoughts, but then can I ask for the first speaker for the proposition and the first speaker of the opposition to just share some thoughts about each other's style, each other's arguments, those kind of things, whatever you feel is appropriate. Proposition, do you want to go first, and then we'll go?
Yeah, okay.
Great.
I thought, Izzy, you have very clear points. So I thought it was quite easy to follow. I thought you explained the rebuttals well, and they were sort of well run into the points themselves, which I thought was good. And used sort of evidence to support what you were saying. So, for instance, the figure about divorce, I think it was, in England, which I thought was gave it sort of gave it backing, I guess. What I would say negative, you didn't take many points of information. I noticed we sort of gave you quite a few and you weren't taking them, but I mean, I think you took one at the start, and I did think it was slightly the choice of argument of the purity of, was it heroin? I thought that was a slightly odd argument, that lockdown is bad because it's decreasing the purity of heroin. I think it's slightly sort of twist. I mean, I kind of get where you're coming from, but it's slightly twisted the sort of the point of lockdown. I guess it's kind of a separate issue on its own. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. Izzy, do you want to share some thoughts now?
I thought you spoke very well as well. You had clear points. You outlined the structure of your debate as well as your partner's debate, which I thought was very good. So you had a nice flow to it. I think that you did an interesting way of defining emotion. Definitely, we didn't envision that, but I think if you're going to refine it by that much, you've got to be careful that all of the evidence that you use and the points that you bring up fits within it. Because I think the points that you made about Germany and also the generalization you made about education, it's only relevant to your argument if you fit it in to the motion that you've set out for us. But apart from that, I thought you had really good points, and yeah, it was pretty good.
Good, excellent. Thank you very much. Really nice, constructive feedback. Thank you both. Can I invite now the second speakers to do something similar?
It was generally very solid, I thought. I thought it was well structured, points were well made. Just one very minor criticism was you called out the opposition for, first of all, defining the motion as a certain sort of slice of the lockdown guidelines. And you said that after that, we then took evidence that referred to the whole of lockdown. And so you condemned us to that, which was correct, I thought. But then you later, when you were discussing, I can't remember what it was. Oh yeah, the closures of businesses, for example, you said businesses were closed at the beginning of lockdown, or something along those lines. You then referred back to the lockdown before our defined motion as well. So you did the same thing. But generally, it was very good.
Good, thank you. And opposition?
Yeah, I thought you spoke very well, very assured, very eloquent style. I like you had very good structure in your speech. You obviously had two big pillars that you worked off, some good patterns running through. Obviously, you ran out of time a little bit at the end, but to be fair, so did I. But I thought you had a very good conclusion as well. It was generally very good.
Could I just interrupt and ask the second speakers, you have a very particular role in the debate. Could you perhaps articulate a little how you saw each other taking the debate forward, extending? What is your role as second speakers?
Well, often it's often open, but just to rebut the points of the previous speakers. So the first speaker of the proposition or opposition, I thought that especially Thomas spent quite a long time on rebuttals at the beginning of his speech. Not that that was particularly a negative thing, but and yeah, so to rebut and not necessarily to bring in too many new points because it doesn't give the opposing side much time to combat them. But
yeah, I think it's just about firstly continuing the arguments made by your first speaker, but probably more importantly, just providing some solid evidence and some solid argument against so for example, in my case, the first speaker of the proposition. So ideally you want to be preempting whatever the first speaker of the proposition is going to say, or the first speaker of the opposition, and try and have some sort of argument to rebut what you think they might be about to say. And then obviously you also want to be responding to the second speaker of the proposition if you're in the opposition.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you both. We managed to pit two family members against each other there, but you were both very kind to each other. Can I ask now the summary speakers to do the same?
Yeah, sure. I thought Oshin was really good. You summarised the points of your team, your side really well. I thought what was really good about yours is that you had, your points of clash, which I think I probably forgot to do in mine, and I think that really added and sort of gave a really good conclusion to your side of the argument. So I thought that was really good, really effective.
Excellent, thank you. And Oshin, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so Brattle, as always, really, really clear, very easy to follow. And you didn't bring in much new information, but you brought in new information which sort of like backed up points which were being challenged slightly, which I thought was really good. And that sort of cements your point. And yeah, you went over your argument and you summarized, you did what a summary speaker should do and just summarized very well, made sure everything that you want to say was said and was clear.
Good. What do you both feel is the main difference between a summary speaker and the two speakers that have gone before? Do you think there's anything different about structure and style that you need to bring in that the others don't?
Well, I mean, obviously you've got to deal with all the different points from the floor, because so I think it's important not to give too much new information, but maybe add one or two examples here and there. But I don't really think that's your main idea, not to add new ideas. I think it's just that you have a clearly structured why this is good, why our side's better than theirs, points of clash, and a sort of important end, so that everyone knows what you have a sort of last word, a good leaving point.
Yeah, agreed. And I think I'd just add that you can't really have a speech pre-written for that, and you have to try and do it without having a speech and just as little notes as you can, because otherwise you're just going to try and preemptively guess what the other team's going to say and get it wrong most of the time. I find that quite difficult, but yeah.
Excellent. Great. Thank you all for very constructive feedback.
I thought, just to survey the whole thing, I felt we had a really crisp presentation of key issues from both sides. We had a clear definition, and I think everything has been said actually about the definition, because I'm not sure you actually gained so much from it, and the opposition had you for choosing illustrations from outside it. I was really impressed by both sides' use of POIs and the way in which you were careful to take them when you wanted to take them. You finished what you wanted to say, your sentence, you didn't feel rushed, and then you took your POI. And I thought it was very good that the POIs were presented very briskly and the answers were also presented really briskly. I would say to all speakers, please watch your speed. I know you've got lots of interesting things you want to share with us, but there is a time element here. And our chair was hammering away with that gavel, and we were in danger on several occasions of overrunning. So I think one has to be very mindful of the time, and sometimes one has to cut the cloth according to the clock, which is difficult to do and maybe something we could all think about. Another great strength of the debate, I thought, was the excellent use of nuggets of proof, data, illustrations, but they were very briskly deployed so that we didn't lose the argument in the illustration. And I thought that was excellent. Another thing I'd like to commend was the very clear teamwork. We were seeing lines of argument going down both sides, and some nice little touches of humour, which even in a serious debate can lift the arguments, make us smile, and then that makes the seriousness perhaps even more apparent through the contrast and juxtaposition. Something I thought was really good on both sides was the contending with the points that were raised on the table. I really did feel that you were debating with each other. We were hearing both sides picking up, observing the points of clash, debating during the whole session. And then we concluded with some very focused summaries which identified those points of clash, dealt with the discussion from the floor, and then summarized the lead points. I suppose if I'd wanted anything, I'd just like a few more flags raised over what are your key points, just so that we, the audience, have a very clear vision of the bones of each of your arguments. But that is what I would say. So thank you very much for a very engaging debate on an absolutely topical issue.
Thank you, Mrs. Wells. I would just add to that, I mean, this was really a great example of an actual debate. You both engaged on both sides very, very well with one another. You weren't tempted to just pre-learn scripts and then not pick up on points from the other side. You reacted very well. And that's always very, very pleasing to see. The debating style is good. You were firm and clear, but you were all incredibly gracious with one another. And I think that's something to really commend to you. I know these things can get a bit heated at times, so that was really nice to see. First speakers, you both set out your primary arguments clearly and well. I agree with Mrs. Wells that it would have been nice for us to see right at the beginning, okay, this is what this side is going to talk about, this is what this speaker is going to talk about. And some of you touched on that, but yet make it really clear for us. That would be great. Second speakers, you extended well. And it was interesting to see both second speakers going down sort of an economic route, but looking at it very differently. And summary speakers, you did your job of summarising exceptionally well, very good at rebutting what the other side had said, and then emphasising your points. I would just say when it comes to rebuttals, be careful that you don't take up too much time rebutting. Try and be quick about it, because some of you were getting into that sort of fourth, almost fifth minute before you began on your own arguments. So just be careful about that. But on the whole, I think this was an incredibly enjoyable debate. I think that you engaged with the topic incredibly well and thoughtfully. Some really nice constructive feedback from all of you on each other, which is really good to see. Mrs. Wells, unless there's anything that you want to add, I think Mrs. Wells and I were, you'd be amazed at how technologically advanced we are, because while we've been on Teams, we have also been communicating via other mediums. And we were in agreement that for the purposes of this debate, the opposition had it. So very well done to both sides, but we felt the opposition just took it another notch up. So very well done. And with that, I'd just like to thank you all once again for taking part in this. I know it's the last week of term and you're all exhausted and ready to go and sunbathe and, you know, have some free time. So thank you so much for taking part, for all your hard work. And I officially declare this debate and the debating season over.